It's Old Testament, Class 4, and we're looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, there's an awful lot of material here. There's an awful lot of pages in the Bible. There are an awful lot of stories in the Bible. We're not going to dissect all of that detail. It's assumed for purposes of the class that you've read through these sections of the Bible and that you've read the textbook assignments on these sections, or that you'll go back and read these parts of the Bible on your own. The reason we're not going through all of the detail and which king did what and when it happened is that the theological import here is fairly consistent and fairly tight. There's a lot of detail in the history of Israel, but it is not in terms of the history of Revelation that we get a lot of new detail here. Let's start out by talking about kingship, however. Remember that in the Vulgate or in the Septuagint version of the Bible, we don't get 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We get 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th kingdoms. And so these are considered one long continuous narrative. If we look at the concept of kingship, remember where we were before in the Judges is there is no king. And where did we leave that? Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. Things are broken. It's the low point in the history of Israel in terms of how things work. So we start getting pressure towards a king because there is no longer a charismatic or prophetic ruler the way people had with Moses or Joshua. Unlike the ancient peoples of the Near East around them, the Jews never regarded their king as in any way divine. This would be different from Egypt, for example, where Pharaoh was considered to be the son of Ra, the chief god, the sun god. Mesopotamia and Assyria, the king was held to have received divine power. This is later what we're going to see in the imperial cult in Rome. And so we get the dying words of one of the Roman emperors, I think it was Caracalla, who says, Ut puto deum, I suppose I am becoming a god. Those are his dying words. The Jews never think of the king as in any way divine. In Judaism, the Lord alone is sovereign. God is both ruler and lawgiver. And this does parallel the kingship model found in the ancient Near East. So we get the Code of Hammurabi as the famous first sort of legislative code of behavior where we get an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and things of that sort. The so-called lex talionis. Hammurabi is speaking as a divine authority in giving his law. The concept of human kingship is actually a late development in ancient Israel. The early model is one of personal relationship between God and his servants, the patriarchs. So we've got Abram, we've got Israel, Jacob, we've got Isaac. We've got those who are having personal intercourse with the Lord. Then we have people being governed by a prophetic leader, Moses. But Moses is clearly seen to speak for God, not as God. Then we have elders appointed to act in behalf of God. Some of the authority gets spread around. We get this whole appointment of 70 elders in the 11th chapter of Numbers. Then we get the people existing in a loose confederation of tribes under tribal elders. These are the judges. And that confederation is what we referred to before as the Amphictyony. That model breaks down. It's anarchy. And there is a call for a king. This is where 1 Samuel starts off. The whole book is about the call for a king. Back in Exodus, when we were still in Torah, The Lord defines the people of Israel to be his kingdom, set aside for him. This is where he rules within an all-encompassing dominion. In other words, he has dominion over all of creation, over all the world, but his kingdom is this people he has called out to be his own. God reigns because he's creator, and this is a recurrent theme in the enthronement psalms. You can read those, and they might start out by saying, "The Lord is king." The whole creation is exhorted to praise God as ruler. The Lord reigns over all, but has a special relationship with Israel. He's elected his people, and the relationship is sealed in the covenant. I will be your God, and you will be my people, and this is how it works. So, as we've discussed in the past, the covenant is all about how you live in right relationship with God. The law is not about how to get in right relationship with God, but how to live because you're in right relationship with God, because you have been elected as the chosen people. So far, so good? A lot of detail there. We're going to go on. Because of the understanding that God rules, there's resistance to a king reflected in early scripture. So in the 8th chapter of Judges, for example, Gideon refuses kingship. "I will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." The lack of governmental continuity, however, results in moral decline. That's the era of the Judges. Everybody does what's right in his own eyes. Under the Judges, the people walked in the right way under the right leader. The last judge, Samuel, led wisely, but his sons did not walk in his ways. In other words, the old non-centralized system was under severe strain. And so there are two competing strains of thought here. One is the need for centralized rule that we're going to see reflected in parts of 1 Samuel here, and the danger of centralized rule, which we're going to see in other parts of 1 Samuel. Now, clearly, there's a need for some kind of rule, but we're going to see how that can go off the tracks under the bad kings. And under the bad kings, what happens? Well, the Assyrian army shows up, or the Babylonians. Why? Because people haven't been faithful. The prophets show up in the era of kings to come and say what? What's the essential message of the prophets?
You're doing it wrong.
You are not being faithful to the covenant, and you're not living in justice the way God wants you to. It's called covenant and imperium, would be the basic message of the prophets. Here's what you said you'd do in the covenant, and you're not doing it. Here's the problem. Does the people's desire for a king reflect the adoption of foreign ways as opposed to a recognition of the rule of God? 1 Samuel 8:5. The people say, "Appoint a king to lead us such as other nations have." Now, if you say, "We want to be governed the way all these other kingdoms are governed," you're saying, perhaps, we're not in a special relationship with God. This is just the way humans organize their societies. We have kings.
Or aren't they saying that these other nations have similar code that we have? I mean, it hasn't been as a result of a covenant with God, but it's...
Yeah, it's saying it's more a human phenomenon than a divine revelation.
No, I think they're saying that... I guess what I got was, one of the answers to that would have been from Rutledge, was that the other nations they're not part of the covenant that Israel's part of, and therefore their code was not revealed through divine revelation, but it didn't mean that theirs are that much foreign, so that their code was similar. Some of the nations are similar, so the fact that you're adopting the kingship idea from them isn't necessarily just outside of it being part of your covenant, I guess. I don't know
Yeah,
how
I mean,
that's
it's
supposed
basically sitting there and saying,
Right.
you know, this isn't working real well, this sort of anarchy we have. Well, look at the Egyptians. It works there. We need a king, such as other nations have. The problem is how much of that implies a failure to recognize God's reign. Now, if you sit there and say God rules over all, but has called his people out as a particular kingdom under his rule, remember that we still are not completely to pure monotheism. We get what is called henotheism. Just to define some terms, polytheism, worship of many gods. Pantheism, God is in all things, or God is all things. Panentheism, God is in all things. Henotheism, well, there's more than one God, but we only have one. You have a different one. Monotheism, there's only one God, and he is the God of all. We're not quite there yet. We'll see that evolution in the Psalms. So henotheism, such as give us a king such as other people have, other nations have, could be sitting there and saying, well, this is just the way it works. This is the government model that works. Or it could be saying, we're thinking of you like their God. Their God gave them a king. He has divine authority. I'm not saying this is a clear-cut answer to this question. I'm saying it's a problem. What's going on with this demand for a king or desire for a
Right,
king?
and as I'm saying, I think what Rutledge tries to answer that question, does the people's desire for a king reflect the adoption of foreign ways as opposed to recognition of the rule of God? I think he's saying that there is no opposition by the desire for a king to reflect adoption of foreign ways. It's saying that there is no defiance in the recognition of the rule of God because I don't know how he tied it into it, but from what I remember, it was because of the fact that just because that they were for the other codes that were from foreign nations were created with the absence of God doesn't mean that they're somehow
If God
in
is
conflict.
if God is sovereign over all, here's how he's chosen to reveal himself in other contexts, and we can learn from that.
Or that it doesn't conflict
Right.
with what.
And
these
I'm not
organizations
saying there's
do.
a necessary conflict here. I'm saying it's an issue that people are struggling with because they haven't had a king.
You're right, and then that because it's I think they're very eerie about allowing anything coming in to.
Because we're supposed to be different.
Violation of the covenant.
We're supposed to be different. We are the Jews in particular relationship with God, so we're supposed to be different. We've been called out from the rest of creation. That's the tension in the equation here. Now, we do get the rise of the Davidic dynasty here. Both Deuteronomy 12, Judges 17 and 21 seek to solve the same problem, which is anarchy. The solutions are a central sanctuary and central rule.
Now, I noticed that Rutledge called that out too. Is that something that didn't happen prior to that? The kingships prior to David didn't have both of those, a central sanctuary and a central rule?
Right.
Okay.
We don't really get a king prior to David other than Saul.
Sure.
And there's the ark, remember, is still moving around.
Okay, so
there's a place in Shiloh, there's a place in Bethel, and rule then gets centralized in the consolidation of David's power in Jerusalem. The temple is built by Solomon in Jerusalem. David seeks to build a temple. The Lord says, you're not going to build it, your son's going to build it. So there's a consolidation of power happening that is both where the king sits and where God is present. The king, as God's steward, must be near to God physically. Hence the installation of the ark in a centralized place of worship, the king's city, Jerusalem. The election of David and the election of Jerusalem are paired. We're to read them together. Whereas Saul had been selected, as were the judges, David receives divine election. And so we get this passage in 2 Samuel 8, which is a covenant with David. It's unconditional, as was the one with Abraham. The king is the Lord's anointed now. Get that reflected in Psalms and in 1 Samuel. And has received God's Spirit. This is now a form of kingship that is being revealed to the people as well as to David, obviously. Now, moving on, we're talking here really about what is called the Deuteronomistic history. It's a single narrative that probably originated in the 9th century before Christ, probably in a northern prophetic circle, and probably extends from 1 Samuel through 1 Kings, but also includes Deuteronomy. So this group of writers is referred to as the Deuteronomist or the Deuteronomistic historian. But properly speaking, the narratives in Deuteronomy and 1 Samuel and 1 Kings serve different purposes, probably reflecting different editorial strands here. As I said before, in the Septuagint, the books are 1, 2, 3, and 4 kingdoms. And I've thrown in a couple icons for you here of the prophet Samuel and King David. You can decide for yourself what they might have looked like. Which takes us right into our books of the Bible. Now, we've talked about the model of kingship, and we take a little detour here. And we take a detour into a very short book, Ruth. Now, why are we taking this detour? We'll get to that. It's because of where Ruth sits in the canon. Ruth is essentially a short story told as history. Even if the work is essentially literary, it doesn't mean that it's not based on fact, but, you can make your own decision on that. Ruth is identified in 1 Matthew, or Matthew chapter 1, as the great-grandmother of King David and an ancestor in the line of Jesus' stepfather, Joseph. Now, I like to think of Ruth, in effect, as the Old Testament parallel to the Good Samaritan. If we have the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, Ruth is the good Moabite. Who are the Moabites? Remember, the Samaritans are those nasty, dirty foreigners, right? Who are the Moabites?
Nasty, dirty foreigners.
Nasty, dirty foreigners. Who are they descended from? From the incest of Lot and his daughters. That's, it's like these are, they're from the wrong part of town, and they look like they're from a Picasso painting. But those are the Moabites, right? So I've been in towns like that, actually. We can hear banjos playing in the background. And so Ruth is what? Here, she's the paragon of faithfulness and of choosing God. She's the good Moabite. She is the one that when the famine happens and all that, she says that she will stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. I will go where you go. Your God shall be my God. They get back into Judea. They've been in Moab. They're harvesting grain, and Boaz, the landowner, is a kinsman, which means he has specific legal rights since Ruth doesn't have a husband, and neither does Naomi. They're all dead. This is, he's allowing them to glean his fields under the Levitical law. And then on the threshing floor, something happens. Naomi tells Ruth to go make something happen, and something happens on the threshing floor. Scripture tells us that Ruth comes up to Boaz as he is sleeping and uncovers his feet. However, feet is often used in the Old Testament as a euphemism for genitals. So there is something that happens on the threshing floor, and Boaz takes Ruth as his wife. Now, this is David's great-grandmother. She's a dirty Moabite, and she seduces Boaz. This is another example of how the genealogy of Jesus' human descent in 1 Matthew is saying, God will use any means to further his purpose. He'll use people like Ruth. He'll use people like Tamar. He'll use people like Bathsheba. and he will use such extraordinary means as the Virgin Mary. In other words, human rules don't apply here. Those are the only 4 women named in the descent of Jesus, his human descent. And there's something different about each one of them, that it's not regular. Yes?
Can we also mention that it's the dirty rotten men who did those things to those women, not just the dirty rotten women who God used?
Yeah, I wasn't making a point about the women being dirty or rotten or anything. I was making a point about them being considered irregular in their day and age and in the scriptural account.
Yes.
How they
Men with them
became
were also
irregular, required the participation of men. It's David who sits there and sees Bathsheba, who's only referred to in Matthew as the wife of Uriah the Hittite. It's David who sees her sunbathing and says, "Oh, I like what I see here," and arranges for her husband to be killed. So, absent David, no story of Bathsheba, right? Ruth is written probably after the exile, probably later than the 6th century BC, and so is relating events from a long ago history. A minority of scholars would date the work from the period of the monarchy after David, but most would say, no, this arose later. It's focused again on origins, the way people worry about this. The canon places the book before 1 Samuel, predating the monarchy in the time of the judges when Israel is broken. However, in the Hebrew canon, Ruth is placed in the writings, Ketuvim, as the first of the 5 scrolls of festivals, Megillot. So if you get out a Jewish Bible and look to find Ruth before 1 Samuel, it's not there. It comes much later in the Bible. Why is Ruth in the Western canons of both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text placed here? Well, probably it's this trajectory that's point 3 down here. Judges 21, Ruth 4, 1 Samuel 31 is a sequence that end with a reference to the monarchy. The trajectory is probably intentional there in terms of why the Western canons have placed Ruth here, with there being a foreshadowing of Jesus in the fulfillment of the Davidic dynasty. The dominant message in Ruth, however, is that of fidelity, loyalty born of covenant binding. They enter into a covenant, Ruth and Naomi. They enter into a personal covenant. Your God will be my God. I will go where you go. Ruth's father, Elimelech, means my God is king, and this foreshadows Ruth's eventual commitment to the Lord despite her foreign origin. There's clearly something happening between tribes and peoples in this day and age. And even the law reflects that when it says how the sojourner will live amongst you. So the reason we've got Ruth here is because of where the book is placed in the canon, but theologically it's not really a fit. Theologically it does make sense where it fits in the writings in the Jewish canon, because the theological theme here is about covenant and loyalty and faith. Which takes us to 1 and 2 Samuel. Now, incidentally, I've given you the titles of all these in Hebrew, and so we'll take our Hebrew student in the first row on the right here and ask her to read the name here.
Who's right?
Huh?
Who's right?
You're on the right-hand side of the class, and you're in the front row.
With your right hand, I'm on the left.
You're on my left. We're talking stage left, class right.
I'm not sure I can do that.
Okay, well, let's just take it here. We have Shmuel.
Shmuel.
Shmuel. That's how you say Samuel in Hebrew. You usually see it used in Yiddish as Shmuel. It's a name you'd find in Yiddish-speaking areas. But you'll notice that 1 and 2 are Aleph and Bet. Hebrew, the first 2 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They have numerical values, 1 and 2.
We never got to that.
Yeah, we did.
We didn't.
Well, you didn't take good notes. But we have Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel, begins with some intimations of a change in the life of the nation. We get the story of the birth of the prophet here. How does the book start out? Y'all have read it?
Barren woman praying.
Barren woman praying, right? And so we have this story of of Hannah and her husband Elkanah. And where does it start out? It says, there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. One's fertile, one's barren. This is a problem, right? We get this story of Hannah going and muttering her prayers before the sanctuary, and Eli, the priest, thinks she's drunk and rebukes her, and she says, I'm not drunk, I'm praying to the Lord, and he blesses her. And we get this whole story very skillfully told, culminating in the Song of Hannah, 1 Samuel in the 2nd chapter, which is the model for the Magnificat of Mary. If you read the 2 in parallel, Luke has clearly taken the Song of Hannah and rendered the Magnificat from that. The accounts are contrasted between the Elides, the sons of Eli, and Samuel. The Elides sin, and they refuse reproof. How are they sinning? They're taking offerings that have been brought to the tabernacle of the Lord and using them themselves. The meat, for example. They're also sleeping with women who come there for prayer. Their father does reprove them, and they don't do anything about it. Samuel's story, in contrast, is one of growth of the child in the Lord's favor, to the point where he will be the one who will receive and deliver God's judgment on the sons of Eli. This is the whole series of story where Samuel is the boy in the temple, and he keeps hearing the Lord call him, and he thinks it's Eli calling. Says, here am I, and then it finally recognizes it's the Lord. Then he doesn't want to tell Eli what the Lord has said. But Eli says, it's the Lord's will. He tells him that his sons will be killed, that his line will be cut off, and Eli's response is, it is enough, it is the Lord's will. So Eli remains faithful. Samuel grows in stature and in the spirit. We get an epoch in the history of Israel ending here at Shiloh with the departure of the ark. A new epoch arises with the coming of the ark to Jerusalem. And so we get what I'd call the programmatic verse. In other words, the verse that says what's going on here. And it's 1 Samuel 4:3. And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord put us to rout today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. Oops. Don't try to use God. The ark is not magic pixie dust that you can sprinkle at your enemies. What happens when they in fact try to use the ark in battle? It's captured by the Philistines. The Lord is saying, you don't use me. And so the programmatic verse, the reason I say this is programmatic, why has the Lord put us to rout today, is you're not being faithful. God is on your side and will defeat vastly superior enemies when you're faithful. When you, rather than rely on the Lord's strength, seek to use him, the equation's broken. The rest of the story basically provides the answer here. God is inaugurating a new age in the history of his people. That's the answer to the why. So Samuel becomes a judge over Israel. And his judgeship is basically as a prophet. This is in contrast to the lawlessness during the period of the judges when each man did as he saw right. Saul is then anointed king. If the king can unite Israel in fealty to the Lord, he will be blessed and succeed, and by him the people will be blessed. Saul fails at this, and David is identified as his successor. How does Saul fail?
Not faithful.
He doesn't do what the Lord tells him to do. They take the city. The Lord tells him to kill everybody in the city. Saul spares the women and children. Says, I'm not going to kill the women and children. And the Lord was like, you didn't do what I told you to do. And so the spirit departs Saul. David's identified as the successor, and Jonathan emerges. There's a defeat of a Philistine garrison, and this triggers a test of fidelity that Saul does not obey the strict command of the Lord. He's rejected. What follows is a narrative of the consequences of the rejection to the people. Now, if we just page through our Bibles here, we have Saul's unlawful sacrifice. Jonathan surprises and routs the Philistines. Saul's rash oath. Jonathan in danger of death. Saul's continuing wars. Saul's defeat of the Amalekites, but he spares their king. Then David is anointed as king. Saul is rejected as king. Then David is anointed. In other words, he's supposed to do what God tells him to do. So this narrative shifts in chapter 16 to King David. David's charisma is demonstrated. We get the famous story of David and Goliath in chapter 17, right? Saul has abandoned the Lord is with David. I actually have the LP recording, but to the extent that you don't want to play an LP, find on YouTube Charles Lawton reading the story of David and Goliath and all the voices he does for Goliath and David and Saul, and give you an idea of some of our cultural shifts. While I was raised in a secular environment, we had that record because it was so popular culturally at the time as an example of good literature. And so it's Charles Lawton who toured around the United States doing Bible readings to packed theaters. And it's got David and Goliath, it's got the Garden of Eden, it's got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the burning fiery furnace, and I forget which other one it has. And he does all these very, early 20th century theatrical effects with his voice. It's really quite entertaining. We get Saul's ultimate failure here depicted in ways that don't discredit David. Saul is portrayed as fearful before the Philistines as he was before Goliath. He therefore consults a medium, a necromancer, and he's just banned all these witches, right? We get the story of the witch of Endor. Saul was unable to reach the Lord prior to the battle with the Philistines and Goliath. Now he's unable to have access to God. Turns to a necromancer to summon the spirit of Samuel, and Samuel tells him, you're not going to like the answer here, and then Saul is killed. So we get this ending of 1 Samuel with a long narrative setting the scene for Saul's departure from the kingship by portraying David as turning to God for strength and peace, or strength and guidance, and therefore succeeding in battle, in rule, and in diplomacy. We get a brief account of the death of Saul and his sons in battle. And that's basically the book. Now, theologically, why did we breeze through that so quickly? It's because the theology is fairly simple. Who's in charge? God's in charge. Rule is centralized because rule is not working in a decentralized sense. Once the Lord anoints a ruler, the ruler is supposed to do the Lord's will. When the ruler doesn't, the Lord abandons his favor from that ruler and gives it to the one who does do his will. Is David perfect? We'll find out. Far from. Which takes us into 2 Samuel. And the first half of the book is basically focused on David centralizing power in Jerusalem, the Lord's power in Jerusalem. Conflicts surrounding David consolidating his own power as king. We have a conflict here between competing ethos, that of nomadic pastoralists and that of settled agrarians. Remember, these tribes are used to traveling around with a tent with the ark. Now we're going to build a city and have a big stone temple, and things are going to happen here. This is an evolution in the society, right? Not without tension. At the same time, we get a series of genealogies that are basically designed to remind us for the course of David's dynasty. The narrative continues with David's achievement of supremacy over Judah, followed by accounts of dynastic competition and power consolidation. David then does what? He leads Israel. Zion is chosen as the center of rule, and the ark is relocated to Jerusalem. And you have an illustration on the next page, a medieval illustration of the ark entering Jerusalem. Psalm 68 is considered to be a reference to this in part. Talks about the ark going up the hill of Jerusalem and how the other hills are envious that Mount Zion has been chosen. If we look at the RSV translation here, it also refers to when you led captivity captive. That will later become part of the harrowing of hell under Jesus. But here it's talking about we've now conquered and we're bringing captives to our city. The opening of Psalm 68, let God arise and let his enemies be scattered. Let those who hate him flee before him. That's the inscription on the cross given by the Tsar to imperial officers. This is about power, not only God's power, but how it's lived out in the king's power. The balance of 2 Samuel here, as I said, is concerned with the centralization of David's power in Jerusalem. And we get conflicts in David's palace. Famous account of David's procurement of the death of Uriah the Hittite and his affair with Bathsheba. What's happening here? Injustice to powerless subordinates. So we have a prophet show up. And what's the prophet basically saying? You're not doing what you said you'd do in being faithful to the Lord. Nathan's conversation with David, this famous story of the poor man who has only one lamb, is an example of mashal. It's a form of parable as used in rabbinic teaching. Remember, David stands up from his throne and he's outraged and says that I shall not rest until this man is apprehended and punished. And what does Nathan say? You are the man in this story. David realizes that. We get some more Psalms of contrition. His repentance is followed by an assertion of the legitimacy of Solomon. David is spared, but God executes judgment against David's house. What's part of the theology here? If you're unfaithful to the covenant, there are always consequences in the life of the king, in the life of the individual, in the life of the nation. Series of chapters here recount David's loss and recapture of Jerusalem, with a focus being on Absalom's challenge to his father's sovereignty. Life in Jerusalem forces changes in tribal customs. This is why Absalom is able to gain favor with forces against his father. The tension outside of the household is reflected inside of the household. We get the rape of Tamar here, and this is accompanied by her warning against the breaching of society's norms. Things are broken. It kind of looks like the period of the Judges, right? The loss and recapture of Jerusalem are part of a long succession narrative for the dynasty. This narrative probably existed independently before it was incorporated into the books of Samuel. These are stories that have been told. They eventually get written down. And so we get the final chapters here as sort of an appendix. The pattern of the text is a mirror image of 2 Samuel 5:11 through 8:18. At the end of David's reign, the tribal covenantal realities are reasserted in the face of royal absolutism. Checks and balances are reappearing here. So the material provides a balance to the bloodbaths that are going to be related in 1 Kings. There are limits to absolutism. The king is always accountable to God. Remember, what's different about Israel is all the people are under God's justice as having a relationship with God in community. It's not just the king at the top of the ziggurat and everybody below him on the ziggurat in the Babylonian model. Now, I've sort of made a schematic of that on this next slide. Some parallels going on here. We start out with narrative, we go into poetry, poetry, narrative. Remember we talked about how a chiasm works. We start out with a barren woman, end up with a self-exalting king. The barren woman, the new mother, responds. The triumphant king, it should be said, gives God the glory. I'll have some words out there. And then the king becomes self-exalting. So we see a pattern of the way it's supposed to work and then descending into the way it's not supposed to work. The barren woman is blessed and exalted. The new mother responds in thanksgiving and exalts God. The triumphant king gives God the glory and gives thanks for victories. The self-exalting king is judged and abased. These parallel paths converging and then diverging between the example of Hannah and the example of David. So again, if you were going to chart this all out as a theological takeaway, what would you say? If you recognize that God's in charge, give thanksgiving to him, give him the glory, blessings follow. Once you start arrogating to yourself the glory and the power, abasement follows. You're judged. Fair enough? We'll move on. To 1st and 2nd Kings. And we'll give our good Archdeacon a shot at the Hebrew.
Malachim.
Very good. Malachim, kings. Aleph and Bet. Plural for king, Malek. The purpose of this whole narratives, kingdom's narrative, is to relate how it is that the Lord's people came to be in exile. Because where are they supposed to be? Where are they supposed to be? They're supposed to be in Jerusalem, in Judea, right? They're supposed to be, the United Kingdom of Israel and Judea under one king, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, in faithful relationship with God, worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. And what's in fact happened? First, the northern kingdom has fallen. Then the southern kingdom has fallen. Jerusalem has been sacked. People have been taken off into exile. Does this mean God is not in charge if the enemies win? No, it means God is in charge. And he appoints the Syrians and the Babylonians to execute his will on those who are unfaithful. That's the theological point behind this narrative. In the persons of their kings, Judah and Israel are both guilty of cultic infidelities to the Lord. The divine promise to David, the Davidic covenant, is what stays God's hand in the face of Judah's evils. In contrast, Jeroboam's cultic infidelity is the foundational sin for the ultimate fall of the northern kingdom. What are these guys doing? They're setting up idols. They're worshiping foreign gods. So we start out here, 1st and 2nd Kings start out with the reign of Solomon, 970 to 930 BC. From there to the fall of Jerusalem and the deportation to Babylon in 587. Long time period here. And I've chosen to break it down into 3 acts. Act 1, the reign of Solomon, 1 Kings 1 through 11. Solomon is the original Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because there's good Solomon and bad Solomon. And chapters 3 to 8, we've got good Solomon, who prays for wisdom, is given wisdom, builds the temple, God is honored, everything's great, his glory is amazing. Right? Then we get bad Solomon, chapters 9 through 11. We get the glories of 3 to 8 sort of paralleled in a reverse order, culminating with Solomon dishonoring God. He's been tempted by his foreign wives and sets up foreign gods, right? Tolerates the worship of foreign gods. So that's Act 1. Solomon as Jekyll and Hyde. Act 2, parallel accounts of the now divided kingdom. Story of the northern kingdom and its 20 kings, ending with the demise of the kingdom. Act 3, the account of the surviving southern kingdom of Judah, begins with Hezekiah, late 8th century, proceeds through the 7th and 6th centuries under Josiah and his sons to the destruction of Jerusalem. Acts 1, 2, and 3. Now, that's just one way you can look at this. You can break down each one of these trajectories and look at very specific issues or stories that come up in them about good kings, bad kings, wisdom of Solomon, lack of faith of Solomon. But if you just want to get the overall arc of the narrative here without going into that level of detail, this is probably a useful way to think of it. I would certainly encourage you to read all these details and know these stories. Some of them are great stories. What's the ultimate example of Solomon's wisdom?
Splitting of the baby.
Whether you're going to cut the baby in two, right? And we get the famous aria, or arioso really, in Solomon by Handel, where we also get the arrival of the Queen of Sheba and the wonderful, toccata music that goes with that. Incidentally, the Queen of Sheba's name in Arabic, she's a well-known character in the Quran, for example, is Bilqis, which means hairy-legged one. We'll leave it to your imagination. But Bilqis comes to Solomon because his fame has spread, right? Where is Sheba?
How do you spell Bilqis?
We transliterate it as Bilquis. Where is Sheba?
Egypt?
Close.
It's in Africa somewhere.
Yemen.
Oh.
So the capital city of Yemen now, Sana'a, is basically Sheba. The emperors of Ethiopia claimed their descent from the union of Solomon and Bilqis. And so I guess the last sitting emperor was Haile Selassie. I assume he's got sons around still. But where they are now, I don't know. Probably in Switzerland. No. Probably on a list from Mossack Fonseca in Panama City. Right? The Acts 1, 2, or 3. Any sort of questions we want to talk about there? That's a very general overview, but remember it's Solomon who builds the temple. So I've given you a schematic of the Temple of Solomon here. When Jesus is talking about the temple, when he's around the temple, it's not this temple. This is the temple built by Solomon that is destroyed by the Babylonian army. The temple that Jesus is around is the second temple, which is built by Herod the Great in the 1st century before Christ, on the same site. One of the things you might have noticed if you saw any of the slides that Michelle and the other pilgrims showed from their pilgrimage to Jerusalem is how things are built over other things, and I have to dig down like 30 feet to find what was there before. This is the first temple, and this, as you can see here, you've got an basic entrance. The Holy of Holies is in here. That's where the veil that gets ripped in the second temple would be. Now notice here you have the holy place, the greater house, and then the Holy of Holies. When we get to the second temple, it's going to be slightly different. It's going to be divided into thirds differently. We'll have the court of the Gentiles, and then the court where the members of Israel can go, and then the Holy of Holies. But in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, we have what? The Ark of the Covenant. In the second temple, is the Ark of the Covenant there? No. So that's a different sacrificial altar. Moving on, we get accounts of dynastic dysfunction and infidelities to God. And then who shows up? Elijah. Now, Elijah is never referred to as a prophet. He's referred to as the Ish Ha-Elohim, the man of God. In other words, he speaks for God. And we get this sort of tight literary unit of the stories around Elijah. Actually have had people in every church I've ever served say, I can't find the book of Elijah in the Bible. It's like, well, there's no book of Elijah. It's here in 1 Kings. But the overall framework of the stories in chapters 17 through 19 involves an actual journey here to Transjordan, outside of Israel to the north, outside of Israel to the south, return to Transjordan. There's a big circle around the land going on here. Elijah is a prophet in the sense not only of what he says, but in terms of what he does. He engages in what we would consider symbolic prophecy, such as walking across the land naked. We get the contrast here in the narrative between fidelity to the Lord and fidelity to Baal, or Baal, depending on how you want to pronounce that. We get the famous contrast between Elijah and the priests of Baal, and the people keep calling out to Baal, and he says, what? Call him louder. What keeps happening to the statue of Baal? Keeps falling over, right? And the people are calling forth for Baal to bring what? Rain upon the land, because there's been a drought, right? Nothing happens. Elijah is yelling out, call him louder. This is a very wonderful musical setting in Mendelssohn's oratorio of Elijah. The contest and the drought that results from the Lord's disfavor. In this context, in the drought, Elijah comes to the widow of Zarephath, a Sidonian town, in other words, part of Sidon. What does this mean about her? Where she lives? She's a Gentile. She's not a Jew. The Lord's love is not a possession of his chosen people. When Jesus preaches to his home synagogue, he says there were many widows in the time of Elijah the prophet, but Elijah was only sent to the widow of Zarephath. There were many lepers in the time of Elisha the prophet, but only Naaman the Syrian was cured. What is the result in his home synagogue? The people try to kill him because he's just said that the Lord has sent his prophet to a dirty foreigner twice. In other words, you don't own God. You don't have the franchise on God. Never been a popular message. We get this contrast between God and Baal. Upon the Lord's decisive victory, the rain returns. Ahab does not attribute the drought to God's disfavor, but to the prophet as a troubler of Israel. And the pagan prophets, including the priests of Baal, who are going to die in this whole contest, eat at Jezebel's table. In other words, they're being subsidized by the royal treasury. The king isn't being faithful. Elijah's return includes his encounter with Elisha, the successor whom the Lord has chosen. The prophet returns to a world of food and companionship, and his successor abandons his family and previous life to follow Elijah. You notice how this works in the Bible? The same way as in Psalms, we always get parallelism. Things get repeated or things get contrasted. That happens in narrative as well. You follow the trajectory of the action, and then it goes in the opposite direction. Hannah and David, Elijah and Elisha. Things always happen in parallels that way. The prophet has himself become a locus of holy power to which Elisha is drawn, and from which he will go forth as a bearer of power and mission. The division of the narrative here between 1 Kings and 2 Kings is really arbitrary and does not correspond to a significant event. And we've got to throw in another illustration here of Elijah. This is from a monastery in Bulgaria. One that's obviously been restored, considering that this is a medieval fresco. Now, we're still in 2 Kings now, and we've just said there's been an arbitrary change between 1 King and 2 Kings. Chapter 2, we get the appearance of Elisha. And we get a cycle of stories that will continue into basically the end of chapter 8, with Elisha and his extraordinary power as the focus of attention. He is also referred to as Ish Ha-Elohim, man of God, not as prophet. Because does he utter any prophecies? Do either Elisha or Elijah sit there and say, "Thus says the Lord," and here's the teaching of his will? No, they just basically sit there and do stuff and reveal the Lord's will. We get the cycle interrupted by the story of Jehoram as king. There's some mild reform here, destroying a pillar of Baal, but it's not true reform, and it's not enough to save him, in other words. We get this complex of 10 legends, and the stories are legendary in the sense that they do not name characters other than Elisha. We're not supposed to read them as history, but as representative of what the man of God does. Their purpose includes evocation of wonderment at the hero's powers, but are they Elisha's powers? No, they're the Lord's. Remember, Elisha has asked that he says to Elijah, when Elijah is to be assumed into heaven or taken to heaven, that he wants to inherit a double portion of the man of God's spirit. That sounds rather important, doesn't it? Double portion doesn't mean I get twice as much as you have. It means I get twice as much as anybody else gets. This would be basically saying, name me as your heir and first son. And what happens? The prophet's mantle falls upon Elisha. He picks it up and assumes these powers. We get alternate stories here in which the prophet deals with his own people and in which he interacts with Gentiles. We get Naaman the Syrian here, for example. And then we start a history of the Israelite and Judean dynasties in the last 125 years of coexistence. The narrative will go through chapter 17. It's very similar to what we found back in 1 Kings 14 and 16. And it's really just separated from those chapters by the Elijah and the Elisha cycle, where the focus is on prophetic as opposed to royal figures. So obviously this is stuff written after the fact and put together in a narrative arc. The remainder of the book is going to deal with the reign of Hezekiah, his dealings with the Assyrian threat, and the succeeding rules of 7 more kings. And then we end the book with appended narratives of illness and death, the ultimate failure of the kings. And then we get the first and last named prophets in the Deuteronomistic history are women. Deborah in Judges 4 and Huldah in 2 Kings 22. Huldah's name incidentally means weasel. And if you look at the Douay Rheims translation of the Bible, this is where we get the idea of weasel words. So it's, we're not, this is kind of a slam on women here, okay? Huldah pronounces a prophecy of doom, and the book ends with Judah subject to Babylon. In other words, the woman does not have a welcome message here. Now, you can read all kinds of different feminist criticism into that if you want. The point of the matter is it's an interesting bookend here between when things are really wrong and we get Deborah named as a judge, and then when things fall apart again and Huldah is a prophet. From a feminist perspective, one could say that's part of a patriarchal narrative. You don't have to accept that perspective, but that's one possible reading of this.
Or a very wise woman is actually telling the truth to men who won't listen to anything else.
Yeah, I think the feminists would agree with that, and they'd say that the placement of these things in the canon is because men wrote most of this stuff down and they're trying to put a woman in an unfavorable light because they didn't like the message, or they don't want a woman to be the one who has the message to give them. I am not saying that these are in fact weasel words. I am not saying that women can't be prophets or judges. I'm saying where things get placed in the canon, what we call canon criticism. If you say this is a patriarchal system, then as a feminist you'd say, see what they're up to here. That's my point.
I don't read it public.
I would think that just the opposite. Because it's a patriarchal system, the words of doom came from a woman actually raises women up as the bearers of the truth rather than demean them. To me, and Deborah's basically telling all the men, you are, you're gonna let a woman win the day? To me, that's very matriarchal in that women win at the end here. I don't think that's a slam against women at all. I think it's actually see women participate in a very powerful way.
I'm not sure we're disagreeing. I think we're just looking at it from opposite sides of the coin.
Well, what a surprise.
Go figure. We've never done that before. Ever. We see things always through the same lens, synopticon, right? Yeah, there you go. We need to get the Archdeacon an eyeglass, don't you think?
Then you can see if they're the same.
Right. Now, the other thing we were going to talk about briefly is covenant community. We've talked about this narrative of kingship. And it's pretty simple theology, right? Do what God reveals to you. What about the covenant? Well, this is going to set us up to go into the prophets. The central message of the prophets is always going to be to call people back to the covenant and say, here's what you said you'd do, and you're not doing it. And they're also going to condemn injustice and oppression. But if you live under the covenant, there will be no injustice and oppression anyway. So you can't separate faith, the practice of religion, and personal conduct in an Old Testament worldview. These are not private matters. It's not a compartmentalized world. We now live in a world where we're used to faith being characterized as private, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to live one's faith in the public square in the ways that it used to be more acceptable in this country or in the West. It's becoming more privatized in that sense as a passive verb. So faith is lived in community. It's not an individual issue here. When we talked in church history about the rise of certain reform movements emphasizing an individual relationship with God, this is again in tension with the idea that we only do this in a community in the body of the church. In the Old Testament worldview, this is the people of Israel, the people of the covenant, the chosen people, those elected. Relationship with God and neighbor are interlinked and reflect each other. How does Jesus summarize the law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength, etc., and love your neighbor as yourself. He quotes Deuteronomy 6, the Shema Yisrael, and Leviticus 19 about one's duties to neighbor. From a Christian perspective, we would say, this is about our vertical relationship with God, me and God, and our horizontal relationship with each other, and they come together at the cross. So any attempt to separate faith from lifestyle and to focus on ritual is condemned by the prophets. Now let's put that in our context of the church today. We could do everything, quote unquote, perfectly on a Sunday. Have the most gorgeous, seamless, beautiful, spiky high Percy Dirmer Anglo-Catholic liturgy, and make the liturgy itself into an idol. We could be worshiping the worship rather than worshiping God. I myself have been in churches where I think everything was done beautifully and God hasn't shown up in years because they're worshiping the worship. That's a tension here. People get focused on how things happen rather than who is in charge, who worship is being offered to, why we worship. The nature and character of God himself forms the basis of ethical behavior. It's because of who God is and who he calls us to be that we behave the way we're supposed to behave when we do. If we behave in ways that are inimical to God's revealed will, we're saying we're not in right relationship with him anymore, and that gets expressed in a breakdown in our relationships with our neighbor, right? So if I decide that the 10 Commandments don't apply to me today and that robbery is okay and I steal from my neighbor, I'm injuring my neighbor, but it's because my relationship with God is broken and I've said his commandments are not in charge. Vice versa. It's a dynamic system. The Lord requires of his people the qualities he displays in himself: justice, mercy, a loving God. All the characteristics that Paul is going to, for example, give us in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind, love vaunteth not itself, the idea of self-giving. So I've drawn you a schematic here. And we've got, obviously, God on top, the theological angle. That God's character is what matters. God chooses to reveal to us who he is and what his will is for us. This is how the covenant works. God reveals who he is, his character is revealed, and that's what matters. Then we get The economic angle here, the land. The land is given to this is Old Testament now. The land is given by God. Prosperity and safety are dependent on right relationship with God. That's a theta, which is the Greek letter theta is a theological shorthand for God if you're running out of space. Same way you'd put a Cairo for Jesus. Now, from an Old Testament perspective, we see that break down. The right relationship with God breaks down. The net result is a loss of prosperity and safety, and the kingdoms fall. From a Christian perspective, we would say that the tension there is a Christian pursuit of theocracy. Look at what happened in Geneva. Look at what happened in Massachusetts. If we're tempted to say we can manage this part, this angle, we can manage this and make the land ours and God's. We get into Christian nation fantasies where we sit there and say, well, we're a Christian nation and there's manifest destiny, so we can kill all the Indians on our way to the West Coast. Again, that's not reflecting God's will, because whether we're looking in red here in an Old Testament perspective or in green in a New Testament perspective, if you seek to control the triangle because of where you sit in it, you're not doing God's will. And then we get the social angle. Israel. Israel is a covenanted people, a community of the Lord's people. And so ethics are not abstract principles. This is God's will revealed. This is how you maintain your relationship with God, right living in the real world. Relationship with God determines the health of the society. The parallel in the church is that the church, the word for church, is assembly, gathering. It's something we do together. It's not individuals and God. So our covenant, we talk about the new covenant in Jesus Christ. When we talk about covenant in an Old Testament or a New Testament context, we're talking about living in right relationship with God, and that always requires community. It can never be done alone. That is directly contrary to the primary ethos of our 21st century Western culture now, where it's all about individual will. So that's why we're getting more pushback. The pushback we're getting in 2016 as opposed to what was happening 20 years ago. Well, the trend lines were all there already. But the pushback is accelerated because it's now viewed much more in the public square as an actual conflict between individual will and the idea of mutual accountability in a covenanted community. I've talked before about postmodernism as kind of the dominant modern philosophy, the idea that all truth statements are expressions of power and they're all relative depending on who's speaking. In parallel with that, we could probably identify the other major dominant philosophy now being what Lucretius wrote in De Rerum Natura, gave rise to Epicureanism, and it says life has a purpose. Life has one purpose, the pursuit of pleasure. Anything that conflicts with the pursuit of pleasure is wrong. Anything that promotes individual pleasure is good. If you put that together with postmodernism that says that all truth statements are exercises in power, you kind of see where we are now. Does this mean that there's something wrong with pleasure? No. God gave us pleasure, right? What's the point? We get to different answers if we're Epicureans or if we're Christians. So, we've just breezed through an awful lot of the Old Testament, but the theology here is really pretty simple. As we move forward into the prophets, the theology will remain essentially simple in terms of covenant, what you said you were going to do, how you're supposed to live. but we'll start getting all these references to God's anointed as well. So we're going to start getting prefigurings of the Christ in the prophets, and this is going to start continuing the trajectory of salvation history, which will point us all the way to the cross. Now, despite the fact that we took extra time on church history there, we've actually ended a half an hour early. So, who did we say it was his or her turn to pray us out this week or this month?
Well, before I do that,
Questions and discussion.
at the end of Rutledge assigned readings he had for us, I really liked the last paragraph of this, what was the title of this, number 8? God and his people, ethics and ethical questions. And there's this whole tension going back and forth on how that's figured out through the prophets and through the history.
Well, since I don't have my book with me, can you read it to us?
Yeah, I was going to read it because I really liked it, and it kind of, I liked, well, in my own head when I was thinking, I started reading it, and it was obviously about how we understand God's ethics, but it kind of started talking to me about how do I understand my calling, or how do we understand each of our own callings. So here it goes. When Abraham expresses his concern about God's apparent injustice, God debates with him and demonstrates the justice of his case. That does not happen often. Usually we receive no justification or explanation. As we have seen, even when God does finally reveal himself to Job, no explanation is given for what Job has been through. Faced with difficult ethical issues, both in our reading of Scripture and in our own lives, we need to balance the approaches we find in the Old Testament. When the usual rules do not seem to apply, or when we do not understand what God is doing, it is in order to seek an explanation, as Abraham, Job, the psalmist, and Jeremiah did. But where that explanation is not forthcoming, we must also be willing to accept God's silence and trust that he knows what he is doing. In the book of Job, we are made aware that God's purpose may be hidden, and that they encompass far more than anyone's person's life and experience. There is also a rebuke for those who presume to challenge the ultimate justice of God. Recognizing the hiddenness of God and the limitations of human wisdom and understanding, the writer of Ecclesiastes urges us to make the most of the life he has given, with all its frustrations, uncertainties, and unanswered questions. In such cases, Abraham's question becomes the answer. Will not the judge of all my earth do right? We can only trust that he will and accept his decisions. And then they quote Ecclesiastes here. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few.
Well, that's a classic synthesis of what we described in church history as fideism. That's saying you're not going to get an explanation for everything. You're not going to know why. You have to trust that God's in charge, that God is God, and you're not. That's classic fideism. That's just, and the reason that comes to the fore in the Reformation is that you've got people who are saying that we can figure this all out, and that this is a matter of human agency. That's certainly a popular viewpoint now. And so at some point you sit there and you say, we're not going to know the answer, but because of how God has chosen to reveal himself to us and our relationship with him, we're going to trust him. Hard to do when you're figuratively sitting in a ditch. But our examples from the lives of the saints are numerous, both saints that we know by name and saints who we run into on a daily basis, of people who sit in ditches and still trust in God and still turn in prayer when awful things are going on in their lives.
I like the concept there because it brings some sanity to yourself when you sometimes get into insane debates or discussions or
Despair.
Yeah.
It's not like Job's friends are helpful,
Yeah.
right?
But when there seems to be such like a disunion going on in the church about whatever, when you have thoughts like that, it's nice to have someone in the crowd to be able to say that, and then you kind of be like, Okay, well, let's go gather for Eucharist.
Well, your example of the church is certainly apposite because I will periodically, there'll be the latest blow up at General Convention or something like that, and I'll want to beat my head against a wall, but then I'll have somebody in the parish come to me and say, what can I do, or what can we do, or what are we supposed to do when it looks like this part of the church or that part of the church has gone completely off the rails and they're apostate, et cetera, et cetera. And there's really only one answer.
Be faithful.
Remain faithful.
Yeah.
Even if the rest of the church goes to hell in a handbasket, our duty is to remain faithful. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy or necessarily rewarded in this life. But other than that, I think the only alternative is to throw your hands up in despair and, say, well, let's have a good time. Or try. And that's the answer a lot of people give themselves. Or they just check out and say, it's all random, man. But then when you sit there and say it's all random, you say there isn't a purpose to anything, and that'll eventually drive you nuts too. Right? So it's, this is why I think medications like Prozac are so popular. Or alcohol, it's like if it's all random and life stinks today, what do? You medicate.
Party.
Yeah, or, try to pursue pleasure and get rid of what's not good in my life right now. The church, up until the last couple decades, has universally taught that you're not supposed to complain about suffering. Suffering's part of life. God's using this for a purpose that you might not see now. It's not very pastoral in this culture right now to sit there when somebody's really got awful stuff going on in their life and say, well, you're just supposed to. But if you can get them to offer that suffering to God, try to participate in Jesus' redemption of the world, participate in his suffering, sometimes people get a very different perspective on what's going on in their awful lives.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that's maybe the key there, is that it turns the perspective of, it maybe redefines what the suffering is, or maybe even swaps that word out.
It
with
says
something
it's not purposeless,
Yeah.
even if we don't get the purpose revealed to us.
else. Right.
And
Which-
so I
which
think
that's
at the
what
end of the
puts us
day,
on.
we all have a real fundamental need for some sense of purpose. And when we don't have a sense of purpose is when we tend to go nuts.
Which that's what Rutledge, I think, is talking about at the end there, is that there's a purpose there. Just like, you're talking earlier about transubstantiation. There's a presence there. How do we define that, figure it out?
You can't.
We can debate all day long, but
That's where we can say it's a mystery,
Yeah.
right?
You can't figure it out, you're not supposed to.
Right. But, our dominant culture is one that says if you can't figure it out, it's not real.
or that you just haven't thought hard enough.
Or you haven't thought hard enough, right? You've been
Somebody's
blinded
hiding
by
something from you.
somebody's hiding something from you, right? There's secret knowledge. Now, who is our prayer today? We agreed this last time.
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Nobody took
I think we
minutes.
didn't even, that topic did not come up.
Somebody raise their hand and say a
We
prayer.
were all rushing out the door.
I wasn't here, so I don't recall.
Would
I
you-
think we lifted, yeah.
Oh, so we nominated you.
That must have been it. I'll make it quick.
Yeah, okay.
Dear Lord, we thank you for these sessions that we've had today and that we've been having, and we can learn more about you, the history of your church, and the history of why we believe as we do. I ask that you give us all safety as we drive home, and I ask your special blessing on this choir that's here today. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you.
Excellent.